Welcome to Introduction to Ecology, Lesson 23. Today we're going to talk about a topic that can sometimes be controversial. But in reality, it shouldn't be controversial. It may be controversial in your social life, in your political life, but when it comes to science, the answer is pretty clear. We're going to talk about climate change, and 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real. Not only that, they also agree that humans, you and I, are to blame, that this is not some geological, long time period trend that we have nothing to do with, that we are actively responsible for the climate change that we see. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about why that climate change is happening, what we're doing to make it happen, and what the impacts might be for ecological systems. Now, before I move on, I want to give you some support for your family at Thanksgiving, for example. When they tell you, oh, climate change can't be happening because it's cold today, or it was cold last Thanksgiving. What I call that is cherry picking. You have one or two cold days, or one or two cold months, or one or two regions in the globe where the temperatures have actually been cooling for the last decade or century. And people pull those out and say, look, climate change isn't happening because of this one example. Again, that's not how science works. We don't look at one example. We look at broad trends. And so basically, when you try to tell me that climate change isn't happening because it's really cold in Clemson today, I don't believe you. That's not a good argument. That's not a valid argument. So what do we use as valid arguments for why climate change is happening, for how we know the world is really changing? We can't just go outside and say, well, feels pretty cold today, climate change must not be happening. Well, feels pretty warm today, climate change must be happening. Instead, we have to have systematic methods for studying climate change, for detecting these long-term trends that show us that, there may be a little variation from day to day or year to year, but over the long run, in the long game, bad things are happening. And so the first method that we use to study climate change is observation. And again, we don't look for sort of a single event or a single day or a single year. We look over time, we look over space, and we look across species. So here's a figure that shows how the change in spring timing, or what we call phenology, has moved earlier or later for a variety of different species. For amphibians in dark blue, for birds in yellow, for butterflies in teal, for herbs and grasses in green, shrubs in black, trees in brown, and then fish, flies, and mammals in red. And what you'll notice is that, yes, indeed, I can cherry pick examples. Here are some amphibians where spring timing, they've sort of started their lives later in the year, which is not what you would expect with climate change. With warming, you'd expect, it gets warmer earlier, I'm going to start my life earlier, my seasonal life cycle earlier. So yes, there's a few examples where animals have moved later, and that's sort of a counter-argument to the fact that the world might be warming. But the vast, vast majority of animals across all these different types of animals have moved earlier, and that is consistent with climate change. That's what we would expect if we warm the world up. It gets warmer earlier in the spring, and so everything starts happening earlier. So again, we look for these trends over time. We look for these trends from one region to the other. When the same thing's happening in Russia and in Chile and in North America, we have that sense that, what's happening is consistent and real and definitely true. Same thing with this example where we're looking at different species. So a lot of climate change research falls into this category where we're taking observations, but not using a single data point, not just observing the temperature this Thanksgiving, but observing the temperature over the last 200 Thanksgivings, or over Thanksgiving everywhere on the globe for the last 10 years, that kind of thing. Another way of studying climate change, and particularly the effects of climate change, are through controlled experiments. We talked a little bit about controlled experiments. And when we did, we said, there's some things it's pretty easy to do a controlled experiment for. For example, a chemical experiment you do in the lab. It's hard to do a controlled experiment on the Earth. We only have one Earth. We can't make replicate Earths and pump fossil fuels out into one of them and not do that in another and compare. We can't do that. Instead, the only thing we can do is manipulate temperature, carbon dioxide, other anthropogenic changes that we'll talk about in the next few slides. We can manipulate those over small areas and see what happens. And if what happens in those small areas is consistent with the trends that we see in the world around us, then we think, oh, I'm guessing climate change is the cause. So here's an example that I worked on when I was at University of Tennessee. My advisor had set up these big chambers and he constantly blew hot air into them, and then he looked at the response in the ant communities. Which ant species went up in abundance, which ant species went down in abundance, which ant species were excluded, did new ant species move in. This is another example. This is the FACE experiment, where instead of blowing hot air in, they actually had this similar type chambers, but they were blowing carbon dioxide in and looking at what happened to the plants in those chambers. The third method for studying ecological systems under climate change is to use models. So you look at sort of where things live today, for example. Here we're looking at the different types of forests and where they are from 1960 to 1990 around the present. And then we predict what's going to happen to the temperature, to the precipitation, to all those abiotic variables that we've talked about mattering for where species grow. You predict where those are going to be in the future, and then you predict what type of forest you're going to see in those regions, how it's going to change. And so you can see that we're replacing a lot of our maple and beech and birch forests with oak hickory forests, particularly in the north. We're also getting rid of a lot of the loblolly shortleaf pine forests that you have in this area. Those are being replaced by oak pine forests. So again, that's the prediction, and that's a model. And much of climate change research also falls into this category. The controlled experiments are the hardest and most expensive to do. So a lot of climate change research either falls into observation or modeling. So what's going on? Why is the world changing? Well, the world's changing because we're changing it. And we're changing a lot of different things. We are changing what we call global biogeochemical cycles. And these are the movements of specific elements through the environment. The four big ones are carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we are mucking around with all of them. Now, to understand these biogeochemical cycles and what we're doing with them, you need to know a few definitions. The first is pools. These are reservoirs. It's sort of the amounts of elements within different components of the biosphere, where these elements pool up and get stuck as they sort of move around in circles through the environment, through the world. The next term you need to know is fluxes, and this is the rate of movement of elements from one pool to another. And the minute we start mucking around and changing fluxes, changing the rates that we're moving one chemical from one pool into another pool, that's when we start to sort of get into the danger zone where we might affect the life on Earth. So again, unfortunately, anthropogenic or human-associated changes are occurring to all of these cycles. So we'll take each and look at each one. The first is the carbon cycle, and this is sort of the biggie. There are four major global pools for carbon. The first is the atmosphere. There is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, methane, various different forms. So the carbon in the atmosphere is important because it does form greenhouse gases. And as a result, because that sort of carbon is up there forming a warm blanket around the globe, the amount of carbon up in the atmosphere actually influences global temperatures. And if you think back to a lesson, probably lesson 8 or 9 in the first unit, what you'll notice is that we talked about this a little bit. We talked about this layer, this blanket over the Earth, and we said that that was a blanket of primarily carbon dioxide and methane, and that as we put more and more carbon dioxide and methane into the environment, we caused this increase in back radiation, and we allowed less infrared radiation through out of the atmosphere. And of course, what that does is we're sending more energy back to Earth, we're not letting as much energy out, and that energy warms up the Earth. That's what's causing global warming. So how have we done it? We've increased flux into the atmosphere. We've increased the rate of movement of carbon dioxide into that atmospheric pool. So prior to the mid-19th century, the largest impact to atmospheric carbon dioxide that at least we had was land use change. We were converting forests into agricultural farms at quite a clip. And that's not great. That wasn't doing great things for the atmosphere. We were definitely moving more carbon up into the atmosphere and sort of causing a warming effect. But that would have taken a long time to sort of get to the point where we are now. What happened is that after the mid-19th century and the Industrial Revolution, we started burning fossil fuels. And compared to land use change, that was a huge impact. That really started to increase the flux of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. All right, the second global pool of carbon dioxide is oceans. And oceans contain carbon in their marine life. You know, all life contains carbon. That's what makes us up. So marine life also contains carbon. There's also carbon in the surface ocean waters dissolved in the water. There's carbon in the deep ocean waters, and there's carbon in the benthic sediment and stuff that's fallen to the bottom of the ocean. 90% of the carbon in the ocean is in the deep waters. And it sort of gets into those deep waters as things that are sort of on top, life on top, dies and settles down into the deep ocean waters and kind of gets stuck there. It pools there in that deep ocean water pool. Now, eventually you get upwellings. Remember we talked about upwellings in different locations on the Earth. And those bring that carbon back up to the surface, releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Not surprisingly, because we've increased carbon into the atmosphere, that increased atmospheric carbon dioxide increases the flux, increases the rate of movement of carbon and carbon dioxide into the surface waters just by diffusion. If I put more up top, then I got sort of more pressure moving in and diffusing into that surface ocean water. All right. The next global pool of carbon is land surface or terrestrial. You and I are carbon and also a lot of vegetation. Most of the carbon is in vegetation and then also in soils. Soils contain all that dead vegetation, all that dead and decaying matter, which, like you and I, was also made up of carbon. The terrestrial or land surface carbon pool is the largest pool of biologically active carbon. It's not the largest pool of carbon, but it's the largest pool of carbon that's incorporated into living things. Now, interestingly enough, soil has twice as much carbon as vegetation. So sometimes we think of, trees as having all this carbon and sort of taking carbon from the atmosphere, but actually soil is where the vast majority of the carbon that's terrestrial anyways is held. There are fluxes between the terrestrial and atmospheric pool, and the sort of natural fluxes are photosynthesis, which takes the carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into the terrestrial pool, and respiration, that takes the carbon from the terrestrial pool and puts it back into the atmosphere. And everything would be happy if we just went around and around in that sort of cycle with the natural fluxes. But again, we've changed those fluxes, the fluxes that humans are responsible for, and they both go in the upward direction. They both add carbon to the atmosphere from the terrestrial pool. Those are land use and fossil fuels. The fourth major pool of carbon is sediments and rocks. And this is actually 99% of global carbon, but it's sort of in a very stable form. It's in carbonate minerals and organic compounds trapped in the rocks. And so we don't have a lot of sort of short time scale movement, short time scale fluxes of carbon from those rocks into any other pool. Those fluxes sort of occur on a geologic time scale. All right, so again, we have changed the carbon cycle. And one of the big ways, particularly pre-mid-19th century, is land use. How does land use change the carbon cycle? How does converting forests into farm fields change the carbon cycle? Well, it does it in a lot of different ways. First, when we remove the canopy, when we remove that shade layer that you have with the forest and the trees, you basically warm the soil. And anytime you warm the soil or warm any microbe up, it actually increases the rate of microbial decomposition and respiration. And so these little microbes are basically metabolizing faster, and they're spitting out carbon dioxide faster, and that carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere. The second way that land use alters the carbon cycle is you got to clear that land. So what do? You burn the trees. And when you burn the trees, you release carbon dioxide, but you also release methane into the atmosphere. Depending on what you put on the field, after you've cleared it, frequently you'll put cows, ruminants. And ruminants actually have a type of bacteria in their stomach called methanogens. And methanogens release methane into the atmosphere. It's basically cows farting. So these methanogens take the food that the cows eat, they make methane, and then the methane comes out of the cow, because otherwise the cow would explode, and it comes out into the atmosphere. Another surprising, people talk about cows, but another surprising source of methane is similar kinds of bacteria, those methanogens, but in agricultural fields. So when you flood rice fields are conducive to growth of particular methanogens. Those are bacteria that, as they metabolize, they make methane. And so you flood those fields, the bacteria start metabolizing and making methane, pumping that into the atmosphere, and then you increase your atmospheric methane. So notice that we talk a lot about carbon dioxide, but land use change actually has a quite large impact on the other greenhouse gas, on methane, both from burning trees, from cow farting, and from flooded rice fields. And that's important because methane is actually 25 times more effective as a greenhouse gas per molecule than carbon dioxide. And unfortunately, atmospheric methane concentrations have more than doubled in the past 200 years. So that's how land use changes the carbon cycle. What about fossil fuels? Like I said, mid-19th century, land use was the biggie. Now it's fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is the biggest thing we're doing to the carbon cycle. So in 1970, anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, that's human responsible carbon dioxide emissions, added about 4.1 petagrams of carbon per year to the atmosphere. In 2016, that number was 10.4 petagrams. So we have really upped the amount of carbon dioxide that we are pumping into the atmosphere just by burning fossil fuels. And now 90% of the anthropogenic carbon flux into the atmosphere is because of burning fossil fuels. So again, fossil fuels is now the biggie. So currently 50% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide is taken up by ocean and terrestrial biota. That sounds good. But the uptake by the sort of marine and terrestrial organisms is not projected to keep pace with our ever-increasing emissions. So we pump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and plants photosynthesize more, marine bacteria photosynthesize more. They fix that carbon put it into sort of terrestrial marine pools, but they just can't keep up, especially as we start getting rid of the things that are doing that for us. We cut down the trees, so they're not even there to help us to sort of increase that pace. All right, so what are the impacts of increased carbon dioxide on organisms? Like I said, there was the FACE experiment, which is the Free Air Carbon Dioxide Enrichment Experiment, where they actually set up a controlled experiment. This began in 1997, and they had little chambers where they blew carbon dioxide constantly into these chambers at different rates. What they found is that as they increased carbon dioxide, the trees did compensate. The plants and trees did compensate. There was an increase by about 25% in the net primary productivity. So these plants were photosynthesizing more and pulling more of that carbon dioxide in. And this basically ultimately increased carbon flux into the soil because as the trees die or they drop their leaves, those carbon pools end up settling in. You get more leaf litter, you get more root turnover. But the problem is, as these plants get older and as they run out of water and nutrients, so rather than carbon dioxide being limiting, water and nutrients become limiting, that is likely and projected to sort of constrain the amount that plants can compensate for that extra CO2. So we see sort of, yes, there's some compensation, but no, it's not going to compensate for everything we're doing, at least everything we're doing now if we don't scale back. How does increased carbon dioxide impact marine ecosystems? Well, again, if you put more carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, then there's sort of more carbon dioxide pressing on that surface water of the oceans, and it diffuses into the oceans. What happens then? I increase my carbon dioxide. This is basic chemistry. When I increase the concentration of a chemical on one side of the equation, it pushes that equation to the other side. And so I start increasing my carbonic acid. What does that do? It dissociates. And so I get free hydrogen ions. And again, that's going to lower my pH. And I also get bicarbonate. Now, unfortunately, when I increase the free hydrogen ions, that happens on both sides of the equation. So, I'm getting more acidic, but because I push that other side of the equation up, it actually sort of pushes the equation back towards that middle equation, and that means I'm lowering my carbonate concentration. So the net effect is I increase the free hydrogen ions, and so I make my oceans more acidic, and I decrease my carbonate ions, and that's actually bad for some of the ocean critters. So over the past century, ocean acidity has actually increased by 30%, which is amazing when you think about it. And it has two negative effects. First, that ocean acidity actually just dissolves shells, corals, mollusks, and planktons. But it gets even worse. It's sort of a double whammy. Not only are these shells dissolving faster, but because there's less carbonate available, and because carbonate is what these animals use to make their shells, they can't even make the shells. They're making the shells faster. So they're degrading faster, and they can't make them as fast. So it basically causes these critters that use carbonate to sort of not be able to make the skeletons or the shells that they need to survive. So between 1990 and 2009, the rate of formation of calcium carbonate by corals on Australia's Great Barrier Reef actually declined by 14%. And think about it, that's really only 20 years. So in a very short time scale, we're seeing massive, massive changes. All right, that's the carbon cycle. That's probably the one that we focus on most, the one that we hear about most, but we are mucking with all the cycles. We are messing them all up. So now we're going to move on to the nitrogen cycle. The majority of the nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle is inaccessible in the atmospheric pool. Remember, the atmosphere has nitrogen, and so that's a huge pool of nitrogen, but you and I can't really use that nitrogen, and plants can't really use that nitrogen. We need nitrogen to build our bodies. All animals do. Plants need nitrogen to grow, but most plants can't use that nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, and we definitely can't. We have to get our nitrogen from the plants we eat. Now, not surprisingly, we have altered the nitrogen cycle more than the carbon cycle. And there's three ways that we've altered the nitrogen cycle. First, we have increased nitrogen fixation by producing agricultural fertilizers. So, nitrogen is typically limiting in plants. A lot of plants need nitrogen to grow more. And so what we've done is we've said, okay, let's give it to them. We've mined nitrogen, and we have basically added that nitrogen to the soil to help our crops grow better. And it works. It helped our crops grow better. But what we did is we took nitrogen that was in a primarily inaccessible pool, and we put it into the crops and made it accessible. Another thing we've done, like I say, most plants can't use atmospheric nitrogen, but there are some that can. These are called nitrogen fixing crops or nitrogen fixing plants. These are your legumes. And we've really increased production of soybeans, alfalfa, and peas. And all of these are plants that actually are able to take nitrogen out of the environment. And so when we increase the proportion of nitrogen fixing plants in the world, we're basically increasing that flux of nitrogen from the atmosphere to terrestrial sources. Finally, we have had that tendency to flood agricultural fields for making things grow, and that actually increases the abundance of a different kind of nitrogen-fixing critter, not nitrogen-fixing plants, but actually nitrogen-fixing bacteria, specifically cyanobacteria. The same net effect. Basically, we have more of these organisms that are able to take that primarily inaccessible atmospheric nitrogen and actually make it accessible and bring it sort of into that terrestrial source where other organisms can use it. Fossil fuel use also increases bioavailable atmospheric nitrogen. So that's another way, just by burning fossil fuels. What's the problem with increased nitrogen availability? Well, when we put more nitrogen into the atmosphere, it forms nitric acid. And nitric acid dissolves in water and actually causes acid rain. Again, this is sort of an acid And so we're going to be lowering the pH of the atmospheric water, and as that falls to Earth, it's also lower pH. Now, you know, very, very low pH acid can kill, right? It can kill animals. But acid rain never gets to the point of being so caustic that it actually kills things, or at least typically. So what's the big problem? Well, acid rain actually changes how nutrients leach out of the soil. And so when I have all these hydrogen ions, they move into the soil and they actually replace calcium, magnesium, and potassium ions. And that's a big problem because these are micronutrients that plants need to grow. And so when I replace them with hydrogen ions, then the plants have a lot of trouble growing. They don't have those nutrients they need. So again, this process is called soil acidification, and it's that loss of base cations of things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium that result from this acid rain, and ultimately it leads to a decrease in soil pH. Another problem with increased nitrogen availability for terrestrial systems, again, many terrestrial systems are nitrogen limited. That's why we need to make nitrogen fertilizers for our crops, because the thing that's holding crops back from growing better in many cases is just nitrogen availability. So that's true in natural systems too. A good example is in some of these swamps and bogs along the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina. And that's where you have carnivorous plants. And these carnivorous plants do well in these environments because they're low nitrogen. And these plants have evolved a way of getting nitrogen from insects, right? And so they basically catch insects and use those insects, not so much for their energy, but for their nitrogen. Now, the big problem is that as we add nitrogen to the soil, we alter that. We say, okay, well, nitrogen is not as limiting anymore. And so that sort of changes the dynamics in those regions. So for one thing, when we add nitrogen, it tends to increase net primary productivity because, of course, if plants are limited by nitrogen, then they can grow better when we add nitrogen. But one of the big problems is that we alter competition, and so this causes loss of biodiversity, and it also increases the amount of invasives we have. A lot of invasive species really do well when you have a lot of nitrogen. And so if we take a look at Venus flytraps, which are native only to that little population, little area on the South Carolina-North Carolina border, what you see is that there are counties where there were historical records of these, and they've basically been wiped out. And probably as a result of altered competition. If nitrogen is no longer limiting, the one thing that these plants had going for them is no longer their benefit, and other plants that may not be able to get nitrogen from insects, they can take over. Another big problem is that as we add nitrogen into some of our estuaries, these are also areas that are nitrogen limited, and so we get these massive sort of blooms and eutrophication and dead zones in our estuaries. Finally, when we increase nitrogen, the microbes can also use this, and when they do, they tend to release dinitrous oxide, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. All right. The next cycle is the phosphorus cycle. The largest pools of phosphorus are in terrestrial soils and marine sediment. And again, anthropogenic impacts have altered the phosphorus cycle. First, we have sewage discharge, and believe it or not, you poop out a lot of phosphorus. So just by sending your poop in different places, you are altering the phosphorus cycle. Industrial waste is another big one. A lot of industrial waste has phosphorus that they've sort of mined out of relatively inaccessible sources and then made them into accessible sources in terrestrial and marine systems. And then finally, phosphorus fertilizers. So many plants are limited by nitrogen, but a lot of plants are also limited by phosphorus. And so a lot of our fertilizers basically just dump phosphorus in and say, hey plants, if you're limited by phosphorus, have some more, grow better. And again, we're getting this phosphorus from these ancient marine sediments where it's sort of in deep, deep pools where we would never access it without mining equipment and all this sort of, naturally those phosphorus would remain stuck there for over long geologic time periods, but because we have figured out ways to get it out, we are changing that dynamic. So again, mining releases 4 times more phosphorus annually than natural weathering. Natural weathering is really the only other way to get the phosphorus out of these deep sources. And phosphorus that's applied as fertilizer is actually 20% of the phosphorus that cycles naturally. Why is that a problem? Well, again, we have that, adding this formerly limiting nutrient into things like lakes, and that can cause eutrophication. The next cycle is the sulfur cycle. This is the final and fourth cycle. The largest pools of sulfur are in rocks, sediments, and the ocean. And there's generally a net flux from terrestrial pools to the ocean. But again, because of some of the stuff we're doing, because of burning sulfur-containing coal and oil and smelting of metal ores, our emission of sulfur into the atmosphere has quadrupled since the Industrial Revolution. So again, we're messing that cycle up too. What's the thing? What does that do? Well, like nitrogen, when I put sulfur in, I form acids and sulfuric acid, and again, that dissolves into the atmospheric water and comes down as acid rain. So we've talked about how we're messing around with all of these different nutrient cycles, but then of course we haven't talked about the big thing that everyone's talking about, and that's Earth warming. And Earth is again warming because of anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. So, you know, a lot of people go with this idea that, well, let's not panic, let's just sort of see what we can do, but that's bad advice. We don't have a backup plan. We have no second Earth. We can't get anywhere. So when we change climate on Earth, when we make it warmer, when we change precipitation patterns, we're screwing it up, both for ecological systems and other organisms, but also for ourselves. And so, whether you believe it or not, it really is time to panic. If you are not losing sleep over this, then you're not concerned enough. Again, I want to make a distinction. We made this distinction previously in the course, and that is between climate and weather. So weather describes the conditions that we experience from one day to the next. Sort of cold today, warm tomorrow, cold again the next day. Climate, though, is a description of weather averages over many, many years. So again, climate goes up and down, or the weather goes up and down. Climate is sort of very smooth. It's always the same. All right, so now let's make a distinction that we haven't seen before between climate variation and climate change. Climate variation refers to any variability in climate, in the sort of long-term trends. So we can have daily changes that are associated with solar heating, and those, you know, occur over and over and over again. We see them from one year to the next. That's climate variation. We can have seasonal changes. It's warmer in the summer than it is in the winter. Again, we can have decadal changes. We've talked about those in a previous lecture associated with ocean currents and atmosphere. All of those are climate variation. We have ups and downs in temperature, precipitation. Climate change is not the same. Climate change refers to long-term directional, going one way, warmer, or going the other way, colder. Long-term directional change that lasts at least 3 decades. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing long-term, much more than 3 decades changes to climate. Okay, here's a picture of variation. This is the Pacific decadal oscillation. So we have these 10-year cycles in warm periods and cool periods. And this is climate change, where we have been basically going up over the last 100 years. Evidence for climate change is substantial. The average global surface temperature of the Earth has increased by 0.8 degrees Celsius since 1880. And in fact, the greatest change has been over the last 50 years. Another example, the first decade of the 21st century was actually the warmest decade of the previous 1,000 years. Think about how long that is. 2016 was the warmest year on record. We are seeing massive retreat of mountain glaciers, thawing of the permafrost that should remain permanently frozen. That's sort of the definition. And the rates of sea level rise have been greater than any estimate from the past 3,000 years. So for those of you who live along the coast, if you care about your house, that's a biggie. Again, we can do cherry picking. We can argue, no, climate's not changing because there's a patch of ocean off the coast of Greenland where climate has actually, where temperature has actually cooled over the last couple hundred years. But that's cherry picking. Look at the rest of the globe and notice that it's hard to find another spot, maybe one or two others. It's hard to find another spot where that trend holds. And so the trend is the whole Earth. Don't cherry pick the one or two examples that are sort of counter examples. What you'll notice by looking at that figure, purple is the most change. The changes have been greatest in the mid to high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. That's us. All right, so climate change is happening, but how do we know that we're to blame? That's the new argument. That's the new sort of try to get out of jail free card. Well, we have the greenhouse effect. And so warming of Earth by atmospheric absorption and re-radiation of infrared radiation emitted by the Earth's surface, that's the definition of the greenhouse effect. We know that's a mechanism. We know that when we put more carbon dioxide and methane in, we know how those molecules work. We know they trap in that infrared radiation and back reflect it. So we know a mechanism. We can see how logically what we're doing might cause this effect. Greenhouse gases are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and dinitrous oxide. And those last three are sort of the big ones in terms of re-radiating back the infrared radiation. And we have definitely been responsible for increasing those. So again, we see that mechanism, we see that link between what we're doing and how we might get to where we are in terms of climate change. Not only that, we see a correlation. There's a very suspicious correlation where all three of those greenhouse gases really ramped up right at the Industrial Revolution. So it's hard to argue that that's all by chance. So again, the contribution of these different gases to global warming actually depends, and it depends on two things. It depends on their concentration, how much we have of them, and it depends on their chemical properties, how good they are at absorbing that radiation and emitting it back to Earth. So like I said, methane is actually much better at sort of the greenhouse effect, at re-radiating radiation back to Earth, but it's definitely not the most abundant. Carbon dioxide is in parts per million. All the others are in parts per billion. And so carbon dioxide is your most important greenhouse gas. Methane is your second most important, and dinitrous oxide is your least important. So again, increases in carbon dioxide, methane, and dinitrous oxide are primarily a result of fossil fuel combustion that started in the Industrial Revolution, although there are some effects due to land use change. That's also important. That started a bit earlier. Because we are mucking with these cycles and because this is causing climate change, scientists now believe that we are entering a new geologic period. And this is like the dinosaurs. This is like, massive amounts of dinosaurs go extinct and get replaced by something else, mammals. And again, so that highlights how much we're changing the Earth. Previously, there were sort of other big effects causing these changes. Now it's us. We're the ones changing the world so much that we're basically starting a new era where dinosaurs are kind of going to be replaced by mammals, except we don't know what's going to happen. Something's going to happen to mammals and all the plants we know. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for trying to sort of figure out what's going to happen with climate change and what we can do about it. They project that we're going to see a 1.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures over the 21st century. So this is terrifying. It's hard to know what's going to happen. Something will happen, but it's hard to know what. There's a couple of ways that we can try and predict what this kind of rise in global temperatures will do. First, we can look at elevational gradients, and we can say, well, how, if I look at the top of the mountain and I raise it a couple degrees Celsius, where's that going to look like on the mountain today? And so it's about a 200 to 800 meter shift. So you imagine here's our mountains with our different zones, our lower montane zone, our montane zone, subalpine, and alpine zone. What we would predict is that montane zone would move up to the subalpine zone. And of course, the subalpine zone moves up to the alpine zone, and the alpine zone goes away forever and ever. So again, that might mean that in the Smokies, for example, in the southern Appalachians, our spruce and fir forests might be replaced. Depending on where we are, in other areas, the spruce and fir forest might be replaced by ponderosa pines. Here, they'll be replaced by the deciduous forest lower down. We can also look at latitudinal gradients. How far away, if I raise the Earth's temperature by 1 to 4 degrees, where on the planet would I be? So that's about a 500 to 1,000 kilometer shift. So if I take a look at the globe, that's almost like, 836 miles from Clemson is Cancun. So I might expect climate similar to Cancun in Clemson over the next century. There's monkeys in Cancun. Do we expect monkeys in Clemson? I mean, maybe. They might be able to survive there, but maybe not. So probably not. We probably don't expect monkeys to move in. There's a couple reasons we don't. First, the average temperature matters, but extremes matter too. And current predictions are that we're going to have massive extremes. And so yes, on average, it might be 1 degree to 4 degrees warmer, but we're still going to have those cold snaps in some of the areas that, are further north. Again, we saw one of those. There's Charleston in a snowstorm back in, I think, 2017. Species interactions matter too, and in particular dynamics of succession. Remember we saw these pictures as our Loch of Volterra, where the species 2 isocline is highest on the species 2 axis, and the species 1 isocline is highest on the species 1 axis. What that meant is that, whether species 1 or species 2 ends up taking over depends on how many you have. And so as we change climate, different organisms are already present in the environment, and that means new things may have more or less trouble moving in, depending on what's happening to the sort of communities already there. Dispersal rates matter too. There's not a really good way for monkeys to get from Cancun to South Carolina, at least not on any kind of time scale without us helping them. So again, they're probably not going to get here. But some species will persist in South Carolina that live here, and others will move in from surrounding areas, from warmer areas. And so the resulting communities may actually be unlike anything we have today, and we call these no analog communities. There's nothing like them. We'll have mixes of species that never lived together in the past. Again, sometimes we think about this as happening, in 100 years when I'm dead, but it's happening now. We can see examples of it happening now. We see that phenology advancing. We started the lecture with that particular example where we see all of these different kinds of animals starting earlier in the spring, starting their life cycles early in the spring. Another example is a recent study where they found that birds were actually moving up the mountain slopes. Again, there's one or two exceptions to the rule. There's the cherry picking, but the vast majority of birds have actually moved higher up the mountain because if it's warmer, they can go higher up and not hit that cold boundary as soon. So that's my little spiel on climate change. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you think about it, and regardless of whether you believe in climate change or not, I hope you mull it over. I hope you think about the evidence I presented. I hope you critically assess your beliefs, and then I really hope that you try and do something about it.